So how does grading HDR differ from SDR inside Resolve? Let's take a look at the Color tab. Now initially it looks like there's nothing different. There's no special HDR flag or button, but there are some changes you need to know about. The first is the viewer does not show you the true HDR result. What does that mean? It means that all the bright values are being clipped. In fact, it's simply an SDR variation. So if you do want to grade HDR, you really need to have an HDR monitor or television hooked to your system. If you have an HDR display hooked up, then you can see all the variation, for example, in the brights. So this is actually a relatively poor indication of what's going on. Now there are some steps you can take to make this viewer look a bit closer to the HDR output, and we'll discuss those steps later on. For now, just keep in mind that this is not an accurate representation of the HDR grade. Now, if you do have an HDR display hooked up, there are a few things to keep in mind. For example, if you have an HDR television hooked up through HDMI, be sure to check one of the options in the project settings. And this is under Master Settings, and it's called Enable HDR Metadata over HDMI. Be sure to enable that. If you're hooking up an HDR monitor through SDI, you have to change some settings on the monitor itself. You have to match the color space and the PQ curve. For example, your monitor might offer the option to set it to BT 2020, and that uses the Rec 2020 color gamut, which Rec 2100 also uses. Another option might be to set the EOTF to ST 2084, which matches what we're using in terms of the PQ curve. So be sure to check those options. As we're talking about HDR displays, it's very important to talk about nits. A nit, spelled N-I-T, is a slang term for a standard measurement of luminance, which is the candela per square meter, or the apparent brightness of a surface area. HDR displays will always have a nit limit. In fact, SDR displays have one also. In contrast, an SDR, or standard definition range television or monitor, can only produce 100 nits. Yet the ST2084 standard supports a range of 0 to 10,000 nits, so a huge difference. As another comparison, if you were to look at a current smartphone screen or laptop screen, those screens would produce around 400 to 500 nits. A new digital projector may support 48 to 500 nits. If you go back to older technology, a motion picture projector would be pegged at 48 nits. Now in terms of the HDR monitors and televisions, those displays will have their own limits. HDR televisions that are currently available to the public may range between 400 and 2000 nits. There are monitors that will display 4000 to 10,000 nits, but those are more rare and much more expensive. If you did have a monitor that could go to 10,000 nits, the reality is that any commercially available video content generally peaks out at 4000 nits. So even though the ST2084 standard supports a range of 0 to 10,000 nits, odds are you're not actually working with a display that goes up to that maximum. And we'll work with some of those limitations later on. Before we move on to grading, two more things are important to talk about. One is you need to make sure your render cache and your optimized media settings are sufficient in terms of quality to support HDR. You can check that by going to the project settings. If you scroll down in Master Settings, you'll see the Optimized Media and Render Cache section. Check the formats of Optimized Media and the Render Cache. The default, which is DNxHRHQX, is actually pretty good, but you can always change these to an even higher quality format. For example, I can change my render cache to uncompressed 16-bit float, which you can see is flagged as HDR. I'm okay for now, so I'm going to cancel out of this and use the default settings. But remember to check that. You want to make sure you're just not rendering out a low quality format that has, say, a low bit depth. The other place to check in terms of rendering is how you're going to render out the final grade. So when you go to the Deliver tab, you have to think about the format you want to render that can support all the HDR values. And there are a number of options here, and I'll mention a few of them. For example, if you're rendering out a QuickTime, you can switch it to DNxHR, or you can choose a ProRes format such as ProRes 4444HQ. Other options would be something like DPX with a high bit depth, say 12 or 16. Or you might choose an OpenEXR, for example the half float 16-bit variation. or even render out floating point TIFFs, again 16-bit. So a few different options, but make sure your format is truly going to support the full value range. Alright, so what else do we need to know about before we actually start the grade? One other important difference is how the scopes work. We'll take a look at that in the next video.